The Last Fortress, How Marcus Aurelius Defeated Chaos from Inside a Tent. Part 1. The Empire's Edge, where philosophy meets the frontier. Mud, rain. The relentless sound of coughing soldiers echoing through the black forests of the northern frontier. Vindobona. The name means nothing to most Romans, just another military outpost at the edge of the known world. But here, far from the marble columns of the Forum, far from the golden temples and the roar of the Colosseum, lies the center of the empire's last defense. This is where Rome's greatest mind wages its most desperate war. Inside a dark tent, lit only by the flickering flame of an oil lamp, an old man sits awake. His beard has gone grey, streaked with white like winter frost. His eyes carry the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. The fine purple of his imperial cloak is stained with mud and the dust of long campaigns. Before him lies a small wax tablet, its surface scarred with the marks of a stylus. Words carved and smoothed and carved again. He is Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, master of the known world, commander of legions that stretch from Britain to Egypt, from the Rhine to the Euphrates. At his word, cities rise or fall. His decrees shape the lives of 50 million souls. And yet, at this moment, in this place, he is writing to himself. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Those words will echo through centuries. They will be read by soldiers in distant wars, by prisoners in dark cells, by people facing their own impossible odds 2,000 years from now. But tonight, on this cold night in the year 178 AD, they are not philosophy for the ages. They are a desperate prayer, a reminder, a lifeline. They are survival. Every cough outside his tent could mean the plague returning. Every shadow cast by torchlight could mean betrayal. Another general deciding the empire would be better served by a younger, stronger hand. The ground doesn't shake from music or festival drums, but from barbarians testing the Roman defensive line just beyond the dark waters of the Danube. The legions call him Imperator, commander. The Senate addresses him as Caesar Augustus. The revered one, historians will call him the Philosopher King, the last of the 5 good emperors, the man who held the Golden Age together with nothing but will and wisdom. But at this moment, in this tent, with rain hammering the leather walls and the smell of sickness thick in the air, he is simply a man trying not to break. Rome was not always like this. Marcus can remember, barely, what the capital looked like in his youth. The city sparkled like a god's reflection on polished marble. The forums buzzed with philosophers debating the nature of the soul. The theatres overflowed with citizens watching comedies and tragedies, their laughter and tears mixing with the scent of wine and roasted meat. The baths were palaces of relaxation where even the poorest Roman could feel, for a few hours, like a king. That Rome feels like a dream now, a memory from someone else's life. Now Rome smells of iron, rot, and funeral smoke. The Senate chambers echo with fear instead of eloquence. The treasuries are empty, drained by endless war and the cost of fighting an enemy no sword can kill. The streets are quieter, too many graves, not enough people to fill the forums. And here, at the frontier, 1,000 miles from that fading dream, the philosopher emperor sits and writes. Not to be read by others, at least not yet. Not to impress the Senate or to craft his legacy. He writes to remind himself how to endure. How to remain human when everything demands he become something else, a tyrant, a coward, or simply broken. This story is not about conquest in the traditional sense. It's not about brilliant military tactics or the glory of battle. This is a story about a different kind of mastery, the hardest kind. Not the conquest of nations, but the conquest of the self. Not control of legions, but control of the mind. Not the building of monuments, but the building of character in the crucible of suffering. The Roman Empire is the largest, most powerful civilization the world has ever seen. But Marcus Aurelius understands something his predecessors forgot. Empires are not held together by stone and steel alone. They are held together by the discipline and virtue of the men who lead them. When that breaks, everything breaks. Outside his tent, a guard coughs. Once, twice, then falls silent. Marcus closes his eyes and returns to his writing. The stylus moves across the wax, forming words that will outlast the empire itself. The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. We begin not in triumph, but in the rain. Not in the palace, but in the mud. Because that is where the truth lives. That is where philosophy becomes real. Part 2. The Reluctant Master. A throne built like a cage. Marcus Aurelius was born into duty before he could understand what duty meant. The year was 121 AD. Rome had reached its zenith. The empire stretched farther than any Roman could travel in a lifetime. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had held for over a century. Trade flowed freely, cities flourished. The machinery of government ran so smoothly it seemed almost divine. Into this world came Marcus Annius Verus, the boy who would become emperor. His family was already part of Rome's highest aristocracy, senators, consuls, men who walked the corridors of power as naturally as others walked the streets. But Marcus was different from the beginning. While other noble children played at war with wooden swords, Marcus sat with books. While they dreamed of military glory, he dreamed of understanding the universe. His tutors marveled at the boy's hunger for wisdom. He learned Greek philosophy before he learned the arts of war. He could quote Epictetus before he could properly wear a toga. The gods, or perhaps just the ambitions of emperors, decided his fate long before he could speak to it. The Emperor Hadrian was dying. Hadrian, the great builder, the man who had stabilized the empire and given it the borders it would struggle to maintain for centuries. He was also a planner, an architect not just of buildings, but of succession. He looked at the empire he had shaped and asked the question every ruler must face: who comes next? Hadrian chose Antoninus Pius, a capable, stable senator, to be his heir. But the choice came with a condition. Antoninus must adopt 2 sons, Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius. The empire would have its next generation secured, planned, ordained. Marcus was 17 when he was adopted into the imperial family, 17 when his life ceased to be his own. The philosophers he studied with warned him, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. But Marcus had no choice in the matter. The greatest empire on earth had chosen him, and duty demanded acceptance. Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, but do so with all your heart. He wrote those words years later, but he was already learning to live them. Antoninus Pius became emperor, and Marcus became his student in governance. For 23 years, Antoninus ruled with steady competence. No great wars, no spectacular achievements. Just the quiet, grinding work of administration, maintaining roads, ensuring grain supplies, settling disputes, keeping the peace. Marcus watched, learned, and quietly dreaded the day it would become his turn. His heart belonged not to the throne, but to philosophy. He spent every spare moment with his tutors, the great Stoic philosophers who taught him that virtue was the only true good, that external circumstances were indifferent, that a man's character was his only real possession. He read Marcus Aurelius, read Epictetus, the former slave who became one of philosophy's greatest voices. He studied Zeno, who founded Stoicism in Athens 500 years earlier. The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Marcus believed this with every fiber of his being. He wanted to live it fully, to be a philosopher, a seeker of truth, free from the corruptions and compromises of power. He dreamed of Athens, of walking the same paths where Socrates had questioned citizens about justice and virtue. He imagined a life in quiet gardens, surrounded by books, dedicating himself fully to the life of the mind. But Antoninus was growing old. And with age came the inevitable question, what comes next? In 161 AD, Antoninus Pius died peacefully, a rare thing for a Roman emperor. No assassination, no civil war. Just old age and the natural order asserting itself. The Senate met and, as planned decades earlier, named Marcus Aurelius emperor. Marcus was 39 years old, and he did something almost unprecedented in Roman history. He refused to rule alone. When the Senate offered him absolute power, the power that emperors killed for, schemed for, betrayed brothers for, Marcus said no. He would not be emperor by himself. He insisted that Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, be named co-emperor. Equal power, equal status. Two men sharing the impossible weight of empire. The Senate was confused. Rome had never had co-emperors before. Power, everyone knew, could not be truly shared. One man would inevitably dominate. Why create the confusion? But Marcus insisted, if he must rule, he would not rule alone. The empire was too vast, too complex, too heavy for any one man to carry without becoming corrupted by the weight. Better to share the burden. Better to have a check on power. Better to remember every single day that he was not a god, just a man, as flawed and mortal as any other. If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. Lucius Verus was everything Marcus was not, beautiful where Marcus was plain, athletic where Marcus was scholarly, drawn to pleasure where Marcus was drawn to discipline. Rome adored Lucius. He was the emperor people imagined when they thought of imperial glory. He hosted magnificent games. He was seen at the theatre, at the baths, at the races. He loved spectacle and celebration. Marcus tolerated him. Or perhaps more accurately, Marcus loved his brother but could not understand him. Their co-rule mirrored a fundamental philosophical question that Marcus spent his life wrestling with. Can duty coexist with desire? Can virtue survive in proximity to pleasure? Marcus endured the partnership because his philosophy demanded it. The Stoics taught that we do not control external events, only our response to them. Lucius was an external event, a circumstance to be accepted and worked with, not against. The universe is change, our life is what our thoughts make it. The greatest empire on earth, spanning 3 continents, controlling the Mediterranean Sea like a private lake, was now led by 2 men, one who wanted power and one who never wanted it at all. Marcus called the office officium, duty, service, obligation. Never a prize to be won, never a throne to be coveted. He saw himself as a servant to the state, bound by responsibility to do what was best for millions of people he would never meet. Even when surrounded by gold and marble, by servants who treated his every word as law, by subjects who bowed and scraped and called him divine, he saw himself in a cage. A beautiful cage, perhaps, a powerful cage, but a cage nonetheless. He was a servant to the state, polishing chains that others would fight wars to wear, and the universe, indifferent to his wishes, was about to test whether his philosophy could survive contact with reality. Part 3. The Invisible Enemy. The Plague and the Price of Virtue. War wasn't Rome's first enemy under Marcus Aurelius, it was disease. The legions returning from the eastern campaigns, from Parthia, from Syria, from the sun-baked lands beyond the Euphrates, carried more than spoils and stories. They carried death in their lungs, in their blood, burning through their veins like invisible fire. The Antonine Plague. Historians today believe it was smallpox, or perhaps measles, but the ancient Romans had no name for what was killing them. They only knew that people were dying. Everywhere, everyone. It started in the military camps. Soldiers who had survived the brutal campaigns in the East began coughing, developing fevers, breaking out in pustules that covered their bodies. Some died within days, others lingered in agony for weeks, their bodies betraying them cell by cell. Then the soldiers came home. The plague spread faster than any barbarian army could march, from the military ports to the capital. from Rome to the countryside, from Italy across the empire's vast networks of roads. Those magnificent Roman roads that connected the world now became highways of death. 5 million souls vanished into smoke and fever. Farmers who fed the cities died in their fields. Senators who guided policy died in their villas. Soldiers who defended the borders died in their barracks. Children died in their mothers' arms. The old, the young, the strong, the weak. The plague made no distinctions. At night from his palace on the Palatine Hill, Marcus could hear the sounds of the dying city. The traditional Roman funeral rites, cremation with ceremony, prayers for the dead, proper respect, became impossible. There were too many bodies. The living could barely keep up with burning the dead. Marcus ordered funeral pyres built day and night. They burned on every hill surrounding Rome, columns of smoke rising into the sky like dark prayers. The Tiber River, that ancient waterway that had nourished Rome for 1,000 years, ran black with the ashes of citizens dumped into its waters. The stench of death covered the city. Even the wind couldn't clear it away. What would a lesser ruler have done? History provides plenty of examples. Raise taxes to refill the emptying treasuries. Tighten control, crack down on dissent, rule through fear to maintain order. Flee to the countryside, to some distant villa where the air was cleaner and death less visible. Blame foreigners, blame the gods, blame anyone but themselves. Marcus Aurelius did none of these things. Instead, he opened the palace gates. He stood in the Forum, the beating heart of Rome, now half empty and haunted, and announced that he would hold an auction, not of captured enemy spoils, not of state property, but of his own possessions, the emperor's personal property. His wife Faustina's silk robes, imported at great expense from China, were put up for sale. His own gold dining plates, used for state banquets, were offered to the highest bidder. Jewels from the imperial diadem, symbols of divine power, were sold to raise money for the empire's relief effort. He stood before the crowd, not as a master demanding tribute, but as a servant offering sacrifice. The emperor's possessions became the empire's lifeline. The Roman nobility watched in shock. Some whispered behind jeweled hands, "Has the emperor gone mad? Has the philosopher lost his reason?" They had never seen an emperor humble himself like this. Power was meant to be displayed, not diminished. Wealth was meant to be hoarded, not distributed. But the common people saw something different. They saw a ruler who valued his subjects more than his symbols. They saw a man who believed that virtue, real virtue, not the performance of it, required sacrifice when sacrifice was needed. Marcus didn't just give money, he gave his time. While other nobles fled Rome for their country estates, Marcus remained in the city. He visited the sick. He ensured the distribution of food. He worked with physicians to understand what was happening, even though ancient medicine had few answers. He applied his philosophy not as abstract theory, but as lived practice. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. The Stoics taught that virtue was the only true good. Health, wealth, power, these were preferred indifference. Good to have if possible, but not essential to living well. What mattered was character. What mattered was doing the right thing regardless of outcome. Now, watching his empire die around him, Marcus tested that teaching against reality, and he found it true. Not comforting, the plague still killed. Not powerful, it couldn't stop the dying. But true. He could not control the disease. He could only control his response to it. Philosophy became policy. The abstract became concrete. Stoicism became not just a school of thought, but a program of action. Marcus established funds to help orphans, children whose parents had died of plague. He created relief programs for the poor who could no longer work. He pushed back against profiteering, ensuring that merchants couldn't exploit the crisis for excessive profit. He worked to maintain the grain supply to the city, understanding that hunger added to plague meant certain collapse. He did all this while preparing for something even worse. reports from the northern frontier were growing more disturbing. The barbarian tribes beyond the Danube, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, were moving. They always moved, raiding and testing the borders, but now the pattern was changing. They weren't just raiding, they were gathering, organizing, building alliances with each other, something they rarely did. They sensed weakness. The plague had not stayed within Rome's borders. Disease doesn't respect political boundaries. The barbarians were dying too. But they drew a different conclusion from their suffering. They looked south at the wealthy lands of the empire and thought, if we're dying anyway, why not die trying to take what they have? The northern frontier, that vast line of forts and legions stretching along the Rhine and Danube rivers, began to crack. And Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who had never wanted power, the man who would rather read Epictetus than command armies, made a decision that would define his reign and his legacy. He would go north. He would leave Rome, still dying, still burning its dead, still fighting the invisible enemy, and face the visible one. He would put on armor, though he had never been a soldier. He would command legions, though he had never sought military glory. Because duty demanded it. Because the empire needed it. Because sometimes philosophy requires you to walk straight into the storm and stand firm, even when every fiber of your being wants to run. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Marcus gathered his legions. He said goodbye to his family, to the tutors who had shaped his mind, to the city he might never see again. He traveled north with Lucius Verus, his co-emperor, his adoptive brother, the man who loved life while Marcus merely endured it. They didn't know it yet, but they were heading toward a war that would last for over a decade. A war fought not in one glorious campaign, but in grinding, exhausting increments. A war conducted not from a palace, but from a muddy tent at the edge of the world. The plague had emptied Rome's treasuries and its legions. It had killed the men who should have been fighting. It had weakened the economy that supported the military. Marcus was leading a wounded empire to face an enemy that sensed opportunity like a wolf smelling blood. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the purple cloak and the weight of duty, Marcus Aurelius the philosopher must have wondered, can a good man survive what's coming? Can virtue endure real suffering? Can the fortress of the mind stand when everything outside it is falling apart? He was about to find out. The rain was waiting for him in the north. It would not stop for 10 years. Part 4, The War in the Mud, 10 years at the edge of the world. The Danube River had been Rome's northern boundary for generations. It was more than a border. It was a promise. On the southern side, civilization, order, law, the prosperity of empire. On the northern side, the wilderness, the barbarian tribes, the unknown forests that stretched forever. For most of Rome's history, that promise held. The legions stationed along the Danube maintained watch, rotated in and out, fought occasional skirmishes. It was frontier duty, hard, cold, far from the glory of Rome, but it was manageable. The tribes raided, the Romans pushed them back, and the empire continued. But the plague changed everything. The legions were bleeding men, not to battle, but to disease. Entire centuries, units of 80 men were reduced to handfuls. The forts that watched the river were undermanned, undersupplied, and exhausted. Soldiers who should have been drilling were digging graves. Commanders who should have been planning campaigns were just trying to keep their men alive. The barbarian tribes saw their chance, and they took it. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Iazyges, the Sarmatians, names that meant little to most Romans, became the empire's existential threat. These weren't the organized kingdoms of Parthia or the ancient civilizations of Egypt. These were tribal confederations, warrior societies that lived for battle, peoples who had been pushed to the edge of the Roman world and were now pushing back. They crossed the Danube not as raiders but as armies. Thousands of warriors in coordinated waves breaching the river at multiple points simultaneously. It was an invasion on a scale not seen in generations. And they didn't stop at the river. In 167 AD, barbarian forces breached Italy itself. Italy, the heart of the empire, the sacred homeland, the land that had not seen invading armies since Hannibal nearly destroyed Rome 500 years earlier. They reached Aquileia, a major city on the Adriatic coast, and laid siege to it. Panic spread through Rome faster than the plague ever did. The unthinkable was happening. The empire was not just threatened, it was invaded. The promise of Roman invincibility, the guarantee of security that had defined the Pax Romana, shattered like dropped glass. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who had never held a sword in battle, made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would go north. He would not send generals to handle the crisis while he remained safely in Rome. He would lead. He put on armor, actual armor, the bronze and iron second skin of a soldier. He who had spent his life in libraries and lecture halls would now spend it in war camps and trenches. He who had studied the nature of the good life would now study the nature of survival. He left Rome in 168 AD with Lucius Verus, his co-emperor. Together they traveled north to take command of the legions. But the universe, indifferent to imperial plans, intervened immediately. Lucius Verus died on the journey. Struck down by the plague, the same invisible enemy that had been killing Romans for years finally claimed the co-emperor. He died in pain, fever-racked, far from the theatres and games he loved. Marcus was left alone to face what was coming. The reign started when Marcus reached the frontier, and it never really stopped. The northern frontier was nothing like Rome. There were no marble buildings, no forums buzzing with philosophical debate, no baths where you could relax and forget the world's troubles. There were wooden forts with mud walls, leather tents that leaked in the rain, and the constant grinding awareness that death waited just beyond the firelight. Marcus established his headquarters at Carnuntum, a military camp on the Danube. Later he would move to Vindobona, modern Vienna, but for years his life existed in a rotating series of muddy outposts. The Emperor of Rome lived like a soldier. He slept in a tent. He ate military rations. He woke to the sounds of men coughing, dying, preparing for battles that might come that day or the next, or the day after. And he commanded an army that was falling apart. The plague continued its work, even here. Marcus would send cohorts into battle, only to have them return with half their number, and not from combat losses, but from disease. Replacements were scarce. The empire had already scraped its barrel of military-age men. Marcus resorted to recruiting gladiators, slaves, barbarian mercenaries, anyone who could hold a weapon and stand in a line. He sold more imperial property to pay for it. He borrowed against future revenues. He did everything short of abandoning the frontier, because abandoning the frontier meant abandoning the empire itself. The battles were not glorious. There were no brilliant tactical masterstrokes worthy of Caesar's commentaries. There was grinding, exhausting warfare, ambushes in forests, raids on supply lines, villages burned, refugees streaming south, Roman citizens enslaved by barbarians who a generation earlier had been too disorganized to threaten anyone. Marcus commanded from the front as much as an emperor could. He rode with the legions, he saw men die, he made the decisions that sent them to their deaths. And every night, by the light of an oil lamp in his tent, with the sounds of suffering just outside, he wrote to himself, to remind himself who he was, to remember why this mattered, to keep his mind from fracturing under the weight of what he was experiencing. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. The pages that would become the Meditations, that slim book that would inspire billions of people over 2,000 years, were born here, in the mud, in the exhaustion, in the moment when philosophy had to prove it could survive contact with reality. He wrote about accepting fate. Everything harmonizes with me, which is harmonious to thee, O universe. He wrote about mortality. Soon you will have forgotten everything. Soon everybody will have forgotten you. He wrote about duty. What is not good for the swarm is not good for the bee. These weren't abstract meditations written in comfortable retirement. They were survival techniques, methods of keeping his mind intact when everything around him was designed to break it. Then came what Romans would later call the miracle of the rain, an event so extraordinary that even accounting for exaggeration and legend, it reveals something about just how desperate the situation became. In 172 AD, the 12th Legion, the Legio Tritas Fulminata, the Thunderbolt Legion, found itself surrounded by Quadi warriors. They had been drawn into a trap in hostile territory, far from support, with their water supply cut off. The Roman soldiers, trained to fight in tight formations, disciplined and organized, found themselves disorganized and dying of thirst under a merciless sun. This was how legions died. Surrounded, dehydrated, their formation broken, they would be slaughtered to the man. The barbarians knew it. The Romans knew it. Marcus, receiving reports from his command post, knew it. He was about to lose an entire legion, 6,000 men gone. Then the sky changed. Storm clouds gathered, dark and heavy. Rain poured down, not a gentle rain, but a torrential downpour, the kind that turns dust to mud in moments. The Romans, dying of thirst minutes before, tilted their heads back and drank from the sky. They caught water in their helmets, their shields, anything that could hold liquid. Renewed, revived, they reformed their lines. Lightning flashed across the battlefield, illuminating scenes of chaos. Thunder rolled like the war drums of gods. The rain turned the ground into thick mud that the barbarians, in lighter equipment, struggled to navigate. Their cavalry bogged down, their infantry slipped and lost momentum. The Romans, trained to fight in any conditions, adapted. They pushed forward. The Quadi, thrown into confusion by the sudden change in circumstances, broke. What should have been a massacre of Romans became a Roman victory pulled from the jaws of annihilation. In the aftermath, stories multiplied. Some claimed it was divine intervention, Jupiter himself saving Rome's legions. Others credited Egyptian magicians traveling with the army who supposedly cooled down the rain through forbidden rituals. Christian writers later claimed it was the prayers of Christian soldiers that moved heaven itself. Marcus, the Stoic philosopher, said only, "Nature did what nature does." For Marcus, even miracles were merely change, the eternal motion of the cosmos, the ceaseless transformation of matter and energy that neither knows nor cares about human hopes and fears. The rain came because atmospheric conditions created rain. The legion survived because trained men adapted to new circumstances. There was no need for supernatural explanations. But he was grateful nonetheless, grateful in the Stoic sense, recognizing that what happened was part of the natural order and that his duty was to use the opportunity wisely, not to waste it wondering why it happened. The war continued. The miracle of the rain was just one battle in a conflict that stretched across years. 10 years Marcus spent in the north. 10 years of mud and blood and death. 10 years away from Rome, from his family, from anything resembling the life he had once imagined for himself. He fought the Marcomanni to a standstill. He negotiated with some tribes, crushed others, relocated populations, established new defenses. Slowly, painfully, at enormous cost, he stabilized the frontier. He pushed the barbarians back across the Danube and established a line that would hold, for a while. But victory never felt complete, because the deeper problem remained unsolved. The empire was overstretched, the military was under strength, the plague had killed too many people, the economic foundation was cracking. Marcus was holding the line through sheer force of will and discipline, but will and discipline cannot overcome reality forever. Every day tested his philosophy. Every death, every setback, every moment of exhaustion challenged the Stoic teachings he had spent his life studying. The mud, the blood, the waste of it all. How do you maintain inner peace when surrounded by suffering? How do you accept fate when fate feels like slow-motion collapse? He wrote through it. Between battles, between funerals, between broken nights and exhausted dawns, His scrolls and wax tablets became the framework of the meditations, though he never called them that. They were just reminders, notes to self, fragments of a mind trying to stay whole. To live is more like wrestling than dancing. He wrote of kindness, even here, of justice, even now, of inner peace, even surrounded by war. The blood and ink mixed until no one, perhaps not even Marcus himself, could tell which was which. The philosopher emperor was being forged into something new, not a warrior king in the traditional sense, not a conqueror seeking glory, but a man learning that philosophy without practice is just poetry, and that true wisdom reveals itself not in comfort, but in crisis. He was learning to embody his own teachings, and it was killing him by inches. Part 5. The Betrayal and the Mercy, Forgiveness Greater Than Power. After plague and war, you might think fate would grant Marcus Aurelius rest, but the universe, indifferent and uncaring, had one more test prepared. And this one would come not from disease or barbarians, but from someone he trusted, Avidius Cassius. The name doesn't echo through history the way Marcus's does, but for a brief terrifying moment in 175 AD, he nearly shattered the empire entirely. Cassius was everything a Roman general should be: brilliant in battle, fierce in command, respected by his troops. Marcus had appointed him to govern the eastern provinces, trusting him with enormous power over Syria, Egypt, and the wealthy territories that fed Rome's treasury. While Marcus fought in the muddy north, Cassius maintained order in the prosperous east. Then a rumor spread: Marcus Aurelius was dead. It's unclear where the rumor started. Perhaps someone misinterpreted news from the frontier. Perhaps it was deliberate misinformation. But word reached the east that the emperor had died, killed by plague, by barbarians, by the same chaos that had defined his reign. Cassius, hearing the news, made a decision. The empire could not withstand a succession crisis. There was no clear heir. Civil war would erupt as generals fought for the throne. Better, Cassius reasoned, to take power himself, quickly, decisively, before the empire tore itself apart. He declared himself emperor. The Eastern legions, loyal to their successful, charismatic general, acclaimed him. Provincial governors, presented with a fait accompli, went along. For a brief moment, Avidius Cassius ruled half the Roman Empire, the rich half, the stable half, the half that paid the bills. When news reached Marcus, still very much alive in the north, he faced a choice that every Roman emperor had faced since the death of Julius Caesar. How do you respond to a usurper? The answer was usually swift and brutal. Civil wars were ugly but short. You marched your legions east, crushed the pretender's forces, executed everyone involved in the plot, and made examples public enough to discourage the next ambitious general. Rome had perfected this pattern. After Caesar's assassination, decades of civil war. After Nero's death, the year of the 4 emperors. The empire knew how to do this. Blood answered blood. Marcus's generals expected this response. They demanded it. The legions, loyal to Marcus, were ready to march east and destroy Cassius's forces. Some suggested sending assassins, quicker, cleaner, less costly than open war. Others recommended mass executions of anyone even suspected of supporting the rebellion. Marcus Aurelius said no. "I will not fight a friend," he said. The generals stared at him. This was not how emperors thought. This was not how power worked. Cassius had betrayed him. Cassius had stolen half the empire. Cassius would have done the same to them if positions were reversed. But Marcus insisted. He would march east, not to kill, but to forgive. He would go to Cassius and speak with him. He would try to understand why his general had done this. And if Cassius would listen, if he could be persuaded to return to loyalty, Marcus would pardon him entirely. If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. The philosophy that Marcus had written by lamplight in his tent now became policy. The Stoics taught that anger was a temporary madness, that vengeance was simply another form of slavery to passion, that true strength lay in control of the self, not control of others through fear. Now Marcus would test that teaching against the most basic imperative of power. When someone tries to take your throne, you destroy them. He prepared to march east. He sent messengers ahead, not assassins, but diplomats carrying offers of peace. He made it clear that he sought reconciliation, not revenge. He even wrote to Cassius directly, appealing to their shared history, to the friendship they had once had. But mercy arrived too late. Before Marcus even left the northern frontier, news came from the east. Avidius Cassius was dead. His own soldiers had killed him. Not out of loyalty to Marcus, they had been ready to fight for Cassius, but out of fear. They realized that backing a losing rebel was suicide, and with Marcus marching east at the head of loyal legions, Cassius's cause was lost. Better to kill him themselves and present his head to Marcus as proof of their renewed loyalty. A centurion arrived at Marcus's camp carrying a wooden box, inside the severed head of Avidius Cassius. The centurion knelt, expecting praise, expecting reward. This was how the game was played. You killed the emperor's enemies and received gold, promotions, honor. Marcus Aurelius looked at the box, then he looked away. He ordered it closed without examining the contents. He refused to look upon the face of the man who had betrayed him, not out of anger or disgust, but out of grief. This was a man he had trusted, a man he had appointed, a man whose family he knew. And now that man was reduced to a trophy in a box, killed by his own soldiers in a desperate bid for survival. "Take it away," Marcus said quietly. "Give him a proper burial." The centurion hesitated, confused. There was no reward, no celebration. The emperor's enemy was dead. Wasn't that cause for triumph? But Marcus saw no triumph here, only waste, only the sad mechanics of power, the way it corrupted and destroyed even capable men. Cassius could have been a great servant of Rome. Instead, fear and ambition had turned him into a traitor and then into a corpse. Marcus continued his march east, but now with a different purpose. Not to wage war, but to ensure peace. Not to punish, but to heal. When he reached Syria, the province that had been the center of Cassius's rebellion, the local aristocracy trembled. They had supported Cassius, or at least they hadn't opposed him. Under traditional Roman justice, that was enough for execution. Entire families could be wiped out for the crime of backing the wrong side in a civil conflict. Marcus summoned them. The aristocrats arrived expecting death sentences. Instead, they found an emperor who asked them questions. Why had they supported Cassius? What had they believed? What had they feared? He listened to their answers, really listened, not as a judge preparing to pronounce sentence, but as a philosopher trying to understand human motivation. Many had believed the rumor of his death. They had acted to prevent civil war, not to create it. Others had been coerced. Refusing to support Cassius would have meant their own deaths. Some had simply made a calculation about survival, and when you're calculating survival, loyalty becomes flexible. Marcus understood. He had studied human nature his entire life. He knew that people acted from fear, from ignorance, from circumstances they couldn't control. The Stoics taught that most evil came not from malice, but from confusion about what was truly good. Whenever you are about to find fault with someone, ask yourself, what fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I am about to criticize? He granted a general amnesty, not just to the aristocrats, but to the soldiers who had fought for Cassius, the governors who had administered his brief reign, the citizens who had acclaimed him. The rebellion was over. Let it be forgotten. But there was one thing Marcus could not forgive because it involved active, ongoing harm, the use of Cassius's rebellion as an excuse for revenge. Some of his own supporters had compiled lists, names of everyone who had sent letters of support to Cassius, everyone who had attended his court, everyone who had benefited from his brief rule. These lists were delivered to Marcus as evidence for trials. This was standard practice. You used a failed rebellion to eliminate your political enemies under the cover of justice. A massive file of correspondence was brought before him, letters between Cassius and various senators, governors, generals. Evidence of conspiracy, proof of guilt. Everything needed to justify a massive purge that would eliminate hundreds of potential rivals and threats. Marcus looked at the file, then, without reading a single page, he ordered it burned. His advisors protested. But Caesar, there may be active plots within those letters. There may be other conspirators planning even now. Marcus shook his head. I will not rule through fear. I will not read private letters meant for a dead man. I will not use this tragedy as an opportunity to settle scores or eliminate rivals. He had the entire collection of letters thrown into a brazier. The courtiers watched in shock as evidence, valuable, useful evidence that could have secured his power for decades, turned to ash and smoke. Let no innocent blood stain this peace, Marcus said. It was one of the most extraordinary acts in Roman political history. Every emperor before him would have used this opportunity to consolidate power. Every emperor after him would do the same. But Marcus Aurelius threw away the weapons that power usually requires. He even went further. He granted pensions to Cassius's family. His widow and children, who could have been executed or exiled, were allowed to keep their property. They were permitted to live in peace. When asked why, Marcus replied simply, "They did nothing wrong. Why should they suffer for another's choices?" In that fire, watching the letters burn, something fundamental happened. Marcus proved that his philosophy was not just theory. The Stoics taught that revenge was a passion, and passions were diseases of the soul. They taught that the wise man remains unmoved by injury, responding with reason rather than emotion. They taught that mercy was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Now Marcus had lived it. In the moment when every political instinct, every advisor, every precedent told him to strike hard and secure his power through fear, he chose differently. Forgiveness became his final weapon, compassion his last act of strength. He believed, truly believed, that mercy would bind the empire tighter than fear ever could. That treating people with dignity would create loyalty that terror could never match. That the only way to break the cycle of civil wars that had plagued Rome for centuries was for someone to simply refuse to continue the cycle. Whether he was right or wrong, history would judge. But in that moment, burning the letters that could have destroyed hundreds of families, Marcus Aurelius was the Philosopher King in full, not just preaching virtue, but living it at enormous personal cost. The eastern provinces stabilized, the rebellion ended not in blood, but in reconciliation, and Marcus, exhausted, turned his attention back north, because the war with the barbarians was not finished. The frontier still needed him. He had defeated betrayal with philosophy. Now he had to defeat time itself. Part 6. The Shadow of Succession, the failure that haunts the legacy. Marcus Aurelius returned to the northern frontier. The mud was still there, the rain still fell. The barbarians still tested the borders. But something had changed within him. He was 54 years old. For a Roman of his era, that was ancient. Most men didn't live past 50. Emperors, with their stress and their dangerous lives, rarely saw old age at all. Marcus had survived plague, war, betrayal, and the grinding exhaustion of holding an empire together through sheer will. But he couldn't survive time. His health was failing. The plague that had killed millions had touched him repeatedly over the years, never quite killing him, but leaving its mark. His joints ached from years of sleeping on campaign beds and riding horseback. His digestion was ruined. He survived on simple food, often little more than bread and water, because his stomach could tolerate nothing else. He looked old. The portraits from his late reign show a man who seems carved from exhaustion itself. Thin face, deep-set eyes, a beard gone completely white. The weight of the world was visible in every line, and he knew his time was running out. This brought Marcus face to face with the one problem his philosophy couldn't solve: succession. Who would come after him? Who could hold this fractured empire together when he was gone? The Roman Empire had never developed a stable system for transferring power. There was no clear rule of succession. Emperors adopted capable men, or their sons inherited, or generals seized power through civil war. It was chaos dressed up as tradition. Marcus had a son, Commodus. Born in 161 AD, he was now a young man of 19. And he was everything Marcus feared. Where Marcus was thoughtful, Commodus was impulsive. Where Marcus valued philosophy, Commodus loved spectacle. Where Marcus saw duty, Commodus saw opportunity for pleasure. The boy had grown up in the palace, surrounded by luxury, told from birth that he was special, destined to rule. He had never known hardship, never faced real consequence, never learned the discipline that had defined his father's life. Marcus brought him north to the frontier, hoping the experience would shape him, hoping that seeing war, death, and suffering would teach Commodus what lectures never could. For several years, Commodus lived in the military camps with his father. It didn't work. Commodus was bored by strategy sessions, disgusted by the conditions, eager to return to Rome and its pleasures. He went through the motions, attended the councils, observed the battles, but he learned nothing from them. Or rather, he learned the wrong lessons. He saw that power meant you could do what you wanted. That being emperor meant never having to deny yourself anything. Marcus watched his son and saw the future unraveling. The Stoics taught that we cannot control other people. We can control only ourselves, our reactions, our choices, our character. But Marcus faced an impossible situation. He could control his own virtue, but he couldn't force virtue into his son. He could model philosophical wisdom, but he couldn't make Commodus want to learn it. And yet, the decision of succession loomed. Marcus had options. Roman emperors had often adopted capable adults rather than passing power to biological sons. Nerva had adopted Trajan. Trajan had adopted Hadrian. Hadrian had forced Antoninus Pius to adopt Marcus himself. The system of adoption had given Rome nearly a century of good emperors, the period historians would later call the 5 good emperors. Marcus could continue that tradition. He could pass over Commodus and adopt someone else, a capable general, a wise senator, someone who could hold the empire together. It would be the philosophically sound choice: duty over blood, the good of the state over personal feeling. But Marcus couldn't do it. Why? The question has haunted historians for 2,000 years. Why would such a wise man make such an obviously poor choice? The answer is as sad as it is simple: civil war. Marcus had spent his entire reign trying to prevent Rome from tearing itself apart. The plague had weakened the empire. The northern wars had drained it. Cassius's rebellion had shown how quickly things could fracture. Rome was held together by force of will and the thinnest veneer of stability. If Marcus passed over his biological son, a son everyone knew about, a son who had been raised as heir, a son who commanded loyalty from certain factions, for an adopted successor, it would mean war. Commodus wouldn't accept it. His supporters wouldn't accept it. The legions would divide, the provinces would choose sides, and after Marcus died, the empire would plunge into exactly the kind of succession crisis that had destroyed Rome's republic centuries earlier. Marcus calculated, in his exhausted, pragmatic way, that a bad emperor was better than civil war. That Rome could survive a poor ruler it had before, but it might not survive another round of generals fighting for the throne while barbarians poured across the frontiers. So he chose blood over brilliance, stability over reason. He made the calculation that would haunt his legacy forever. In his private moments, in his tent, writing to himself in the darkness, Marcus must have wrestled with this choice. We don't have those meditations. Perhaps he destroyed them. Perhaps he couldn't bear to write down his doubts. Or perhaps he had already made his peace with the limits of what one man, even an emperor, could control. Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, but do so with all your heart, even when those people are your greatest failure. Marcus elevated Commodus to co-emperor in 177 AD. The succession was secured. Rome would have continuity. There would be no crisis when Marcus died. But the price of that stability would be everything Marcus had tried to build. In 180 AD, the long war in the north was finally ending. The barbarians had been pushed back. Treaties were being negotiated. The frontier was stabilizing. Marcus was planning one final campaign to extend Roman control north of the Danube, to create a buffer zone that would protect the empire for generations. But his body had nothing left to give. In March of that year, at Vindobona, the same muddy frontier outpost where he had spent so many years, Marcus fell ill. Not the sudden illness of plague, but the slow shutdown of a body that had been pushed beyond its limits. He was 58 years old. He had reigned for 19 years. He had spent most of them away from Rome, living in a tent, holding together an empire that wanted to fall apart. The end came slowly. Marcus was conscious, aware. He had time to prepare, time to say goodbye, time to put his affairs in order with the same careful attention he had given to everything else in his life. Commodus was summoned to his father's bedside. Marcus looked at his son, this young man who would inherit the world and had no idea what to do with it, and tried one last time to offer guidance. The sources don't agree on exactly what Marcus said in those final days, but we know he counseled Commodus to listen to his advisors, to maintain the wars until they were finished, to remember that being emperor was a duty, not a privilege. Commodus nodded and agreed. He would later ignore every word. On March 17, 180 AD, a Praetorian guard entered Marcus's tent for the evening watch. The emperor was awake, barely. The guard asked for the day's password, the secret phrase that would authenticate the night's orders and keep the camp secure. Marcus looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, and he whispered, "Go to the rising sun, for I am setting." Those were his last coherent words. The rising sun, Commodus, the future, the new emperor. Marcus was the setting sun, the old emperor, the old way, the last of the good emperors fading into darkness. He died that night, possibly of plague, possibly of simple exhaustion, possibly of the accumulated weight of 19 years of holding the world together through will alone. His final instructions were simple: no divine honors, no temples declaring him a god. Though Roman emperors were routinely deified after death, no massive monuments or elaborate funeral games. He wanted to be remembered simply as a man who tried to do his duty. But there was one exception. His writings, the scattered pages of philosophy written to himself over years of war, should be preserved. Not published exactly. Marcus never imagined they would be read by others, but preserved in case someone in his family might find them useful. Those pages, collected and organized after his death, became the Meditations, a Stoic's manual for surviving when the world is chaos, a philosopher's guide to maintaining your humanity when everything around you demands you become something else. After Marcus died, Commodus immediately made peace with the northern tribes. All the gains Marcus had fought for, all the treaties and territory, abandoned. Commodus wanted to return to Rome, to the games and the pleasures he had missed. The northern campaigns were suspended. The frontier strategy was reversed. Within a year, it was clear that Rome had entered a new era. Not the Pax Romana, but something darker. Commodus didn't want to govern. He wanted to perform. He fought as a gladiator in the arena, declaring himself the reincarnation of Hercules. He renamed Rome after himself. He executed senators on whims. He emptied the treasury on spectacles. The Senate watched in horror. This was what they had been given in exchange for avoiding civil war. A madman on the throne, a narcissist with absolute power. In 192 AD, just 12 years after Marcus's death, Commodus was assassinated. strangled in his bath by a wrestler, the final act of a conspiracy that included his own advisors and his mistress. They had finally had enough. His death triggered exactly what Marcus had tried to prevent. Civil war, the year of the 5 emperors, generals fighting for the throne, legions marching on Rome, the empire tearing itself apart. Eventually, Septimius Severus seized power and restored order. But it was a different kind of order: military dictatorship, rule by fear, the end of the principate system that Augustus had created. Rome would survive for centuries more, but it would never again have anything like the Pax Romana. The Golden Age was over, and Marcus Aurelius, for all his wisdom and virtue, couldn't prevent its end. He could master his mind, he could control his reactions, he could embody philosophical virtue even in the worst circumstances. But he couldn't control the future. He couldn't make his son wise. He couldn't prevent the empire's decline. Even a Stoic emperor cannot rule fortune. And yet, the failure makes the achievement more remarkable, not less. Marcus tried. He held the line as long as humanly possible. He sacrificed his health, his happiness, his dreams of a philosophical life to serve an empire that would fall anyway. And in the process, he wrote something that would outlast the empire itself. Epilogue: the fortress that remains. What survives when empires fall? The rain has stopped, the tent is empty, the frontier posts crumble into the earth, reclaimed by the forests Marcus tried to keep at bay. Vindobona becomes Vienna. Carnuntum disappears entirely. The Danube still flows, but the legions that watched it are gone. The Roman Empire that Marcus fought to preserve, it falls. Not immediately, but inevitably. The western half collapses in 476 AD. The eastern half lingers as Byzantium for another 1,000 years. But it's not the Rome Marcus knew. The marble crumbles. The aqueducts break. The roads, those magnificent Roman roads that connected the world, slowly vanish under vegetation and time. Empires fall. They always do. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans, the Ottomans, the British, every civilization that claimed eternity eventually finds that stone and steel cannot hold back time. But something else survives, something unexpected. In a monastery library in the 10th century, a monk copying manuscripts preserves a Greek text. He doesn't know why. It's not scripture, not history, just the private thoughts of a dead emperor. But he copies it carefully, word by word, because his order preserves knowledge. That copy survives. Others are made from it. The text spreads slowly through medieval Byzantium, then Renaissance Europe. Scholars discover it, translate it, realize what they've found. The Meditations, the private philosophical journal of Marcus Aurelius, never meant for publication, never designed to inspire. Just a man writing to himself, trying to survive, and it becomes one of the most influential books in human history. Why? Because Marcus wrote the truth. Not the polished truth of public philosophy, but the raw truth of someone actually trying to live philosophical principles under impossible circumstances. He wrote about fear and how to face it, about anger and how to master it, about loss and how to endure it, about duty and how to fulfill it when everything in you wants to run, about maintaining your humanity when the world demands you become a monster. These aren't abstract principles. They're survival techniques, tested in the mud of the northern frontier, proven in the face of plague and war and betrayal. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. 2,000 years after Marcus died, people still read that sentence and find something they need. Soldiers in trenches, prisoners in cells, people facing cancer, bankruptcy, divorce, depression. People whose empires, personal empires, small and precious, are falling around them. They read Marcus and discover they're not alone, that someone else faced chaos and found a way through. Not by controlling the world, but by controlling themselves. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Obstacles aren't things to avoid or complain about. They're the raw material of growth. The problem is the path. The difficulty is the curriculum. Everything that seems to block you is actually the means of moving forward, if you can change your perspective. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. Stop talking. Stop planning. Stop waiting for perfect conditions. Just start. Do the right thing now with what you have, where you are. Virtue is not a distant goal, but a present choice. If it is endurable, then endure it. Stop complaining. The directness is shocking, almost cruel, but Marcus isn't being harsh, he's being honest. If you can survive something, then survive it. If you can't change it, accept it. Not with resignation, but with dignity. Complaining doesn't change circumstances, it just makes you weaker. The universe is change, our life is what our thoughts make it. Everything external is in flux, the only constant is consciousness itself. You cannot control the river, but you can control how you swim. Reality is what it is. Suffering comes from fighting reality instead of adapting to it. These ideas aren't new. Epictetus taught them. Zeno founded Stoicism on them. But Marcus made them visceral. He showed what they look like when tested by real suffering. He proved they could work even when everything was falling apart. The book spread because people recognized themselves in it. Not the emperor part. Most readers will never command legions or govern provinces. But the human part, the part that struggles, the part that feels overwhelmed, the part that wonders how to keep going when everything seems hopeless. Marcus shows them the last fortress, the one inside. The citadel of the mind that no army can breach, no plague can infect, no tyrant can occupy. The space between stimulus and response, where freedom lives. Emperors fall, nations crumble, everything external dissolves. But this fortress, built from discipline, reason and virtue, can stand through anything. The Stoics called it the inner citadel. Modern psychology calls it metacognition or cognitive reframing. The language changes, but the truth remains. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can always control how you respond. Marcus lived that truth in the worst circumstances imaginable. Surrounded by death, he chose to think about life. Surrounded by hatred, he chose mercy. Surrounded by chaos, he chose order. Not external order, which he couldn't maintain, but internal order, which no one could take from him. His empire fell. His son failed. His body broke. He couldn't prevent any of it. But he didn't break. His mind remained his own until the very end, and in keeping his mind intact, he created something more durable than empire. The book survives because it's useful. That's the test of philosophy, not whether it sounds profound, but whether it helps. Can it make you stronger? Can it help you endure? Can it show you how to maintain your humanity in inhuman circumstances? For millions of readers over 2 millennia, the answer is yes. Soldiers carry the meditations into combat. Nelson Mandela read it in prison. Bill Clinton kept it on his desk. Modern CEOs quote it. Therapists recommend it. It's been translated into every major language. It never goes out of print. Not because Marcus was famous, though he was. Not because he was powerful, though he was that too. But because he was honest. He wrote down what actually works when the world is against you. The fortress he built, brick by brick, thought by thought, in a tent at the edge of the world, still stands. You can enter it any time you choose. All you need to do is control your mind. Not outside events, just your mind. That was Marcus's last gift to the world. Not military victory, not political stability, not architectural wonders or imperial glory. Just a simple truth, tested against the hardest circumstances life could devise. When everything external falls apart, you can still choose how to think, how to respond, who to be. The candle in the tent has long since guttered out. The empire is dust. The frontiers have shifted beyond recognition. The marble temples are tourist attractions. But the light remains. Marcus Aurelius is dead. He died exhausted, surrounded by mud and war. His greatest political project failed, his son unworthy of his legacy. Yet in another sense, he never died. The Marcus who wrote in that tent, the mind that disciplined itself into wisdom, lives on every page of the Meditations, lives on in every person who reads his words and finds strength to face their own battles. The man is gone. The fortress stands, and it will stand as long as human beings need reminding that the greatest empire is the one within, the one no Caesar can conquer, no plague can destroy, no time can diminish. If it is endurable, then endure it. Stop complaining. The rain outside has stopped, but somewhere in someone's life a storm is raging, and they're looking for shelter, for guidance, for some proof that it's possible to survive chaos with dignity intact. They'll find Marcus waiting, in a tent, in the mud, at the edge of the world, still writing, still teaching, still showing the way. The last fortress stands. Enter when you're ready. The end.